Well, kia ora, everybody. There's been moments just this morning as I've been sitting here and standing here where I've just found it really hard to sing. Because just the gravity of what we've heard today already. These stories of people who have said, I've met Jesus and this is what happened. Or these songs we've sung where we just get so caught up in the moment because there's a palpable excitement that the power of Jesus changes lives. And that Jesus didn't stay in some grave, but rose again, changing everything as we know it. Life as we know it has radically turned around. And it's just been a really special moment for me this morning as well. I'm also conscious, though, that there's people here in the room today who haven't, at least yet, met Jesus. And you would like to, but you're actually still unsure of what that space looks like in your life. There's also people here in the room who want to have that kind of confidence that it seems like a lot of other people do, but you just have all this doubt. Perhaps some disappointment, because even though you've heard these other stories, you think of the things going on in your own life at the moment, these different circumstances and challenges and kind of brokenness that you're experiencing, and it's just hard. And you want to believe that Jesus can step into that very moment in your life, in that particular circumstance in your life, but you find it hard. You just got this doubt. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I want to speak particularly to those of you that don't yet know Jesus, and particularly to those of you that actually have some doubt, even though you would never express it out loud today, because there's some rules about things like that, isn't there? Because I think this is what the passage from the Gospel of Luke has to say to you and me, so that we would leave today knowing Jesus and with confidence in the story of the resurrection. In a biography of Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, the biographer recalls a scene near the end of Steve Jobs' life. Steve Jobs is sitting in the garden one day, not feeling well, and he was reflecting on the reality of his imminent death. And he said, "For most of my life, I felt that there must be more to our existence than meets the eye. I like to think that something survives after you die. Strange to think that you accumulate all this experience and maybe a little wisdom and it just goes away. So I really want to believe that something survives, that maybe your consciousness endures." After a long silence, he said, "But on the other hand, perhaps it's like this on-off switch, and you're gone." He smiled and said to the biographer, "Maybe that's why I never like to put an on-off switch on Apple devices." See, Steve Jobs wrestled with this question that many people wrestle with, is there life beyond this life? Is there an existence beyond this existence? And I think deep down, most modern people actually really want to believe that something survives us, that we really want to believe that there is something more than just this life, that we live and work and then just die. But actually, a lot of people are just unsure of what that something is. Some people think that maybe it does kind of click off and that's it. Writer Philip Yancey tells of the most unusual funeral service he went to where friends and family were gathered around the casket. There was no singing. There were no words shared. But at a set scheduled time, they all took a peppermint, I guess like this one, and they unwrapped it, put the peppermint in their mouth and allowed it to dissolve. And when the peppermint dissolved, they walked away. And for them, it was this metaphor that this is it. This is what we expect from life. Life just dissolves, and when it's gone, it's finished. I don't think many people actually believe that, though, or at least take that idea with them right to the grave. Because I see this at funerals all the time. Even a person who has no religion at all, who has kind of no sense of spirituality about them, will still have people speak at their funeral service about how they're in a better place, how they're looking down on us, maybe they've become an angel or something else, whatever it is. But we just don't want to believe that to be the case. I think people need to have hope. People need, people have the sense of transcendence. We just can't bear the thought that life as we know it would just end here and now. Just that in the busyness of everyday life, we just don't have much of a chance to think about what that something else might be. We get so consumed and so caught up in our work and the challenges and the opportunities that every day presents to us. But perhaps again, that's where you are today. You've got these questions about, well, what if, what is there out there, and where am I at with that, and have I responded in the right way? And you've got all these different doubts. See, many of us here again have doubts about whether this whole thing is true. Even some of you here in this room, you've responded to Jesus at some point, but because of the challenges you're going through, you're just unsure. We have these doubts about whether Jesus really did rise. We want to believe it, but we're just unsure. As a church, we've spent the last 4 or 5 months going through the Gospel of Luke. It's a series we've called The Story of Jesus. It's one of the 4 accounts that we find in the Bible: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the reason Luke says he wrote this account of Jesus is because he wants us to, the words he used are to know for sure. Because Luke knows that there are people here today who have some doubts about the whole thing. So he tells the story of Jesus to take away the confusion and dispel the doubts that you're going through. He's honest about the disappointments that people go through. He's honest about the stories even back then of people who had doubts and confusion even after Jesus' tomb was empty. In fact, this is one of the reasons I love the Gospels so much, particularly Luke, because he's so honest about the details. If you were trying to make up a story like this, you would almost take away the doubt, you take away the confusion, because it doesn't really help your cause. It doesn't help the cause when leaders would deny knowing Jesus and all these other stories that he places in here, but they're there because this is the real deal. So I love the story that Luke tells us to help us understand what happened that day we call Easter Sunday, when 2 people encountered the resurrected Jesus. And he tells this story rather than the over 500 other stories he could have told of the way people encountered this resurrection Jesus on the same day. But this is the story that Luke tells. That same day, 2 of Jesus' followers were walking to the village of Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. As they walked along, they were talking about everything that had happened. We read that these 2 friends are walking down this Emmaus road just after Jesus has died. And they've heard that Jesus' tomb is empty, but they've assumed that someone must have stolen the body of Jesus. Luke goes on later and he tells us that they're confused, they're disappointed, they're devastated, because they had pinned all their hopes on Jesus to deliver the Jewish people from this Roman oppression. They'd seen Jesus do miracles, they're amazed at his teachings, and then they saw Jesus die at the hands of the very people that they thought Jesus was going to overturn. And now his body's missing from the tomb. They've assumed that somebody must have taken it because, well, they're not thinking about the resurrection. And I think Luke's kind of wanting us to kind of step into their shoes for a moment, because this is the way we often feel in life as well. He knows that some of us here today will be full of doubts about Jesus rising from the dead. Again, you might never express these doubts out loud because of those unspoken rules that we have, but deep down you wonder whether this whole thing could actually be true. And Luke wants to speak to you today. I think Luke is also conscious of the people who are disappointed that God hasn't shown up like they would like him to. The times when things just haven't worked out like we would hope them to. And it's in those times we want to cling to hope, and you want this to be true. It's just you've had a run of bad luck, and despair is what you experience today. And some of you are in that very spot this moment. See, doubt and disappointment are what these 2 are feeling as they walk along this Emmaus road on this very first Easter Sunday. And as they walk along the road, they're talking to each other about all these confusing things they're hearing, and they're trying to work out why Jesus had to die and why his tomb's empty, and they're just trying to make sense of the whole story. Luke continues. As they talked and discussed these things, Jesus himself suddenly came and began walking with them. But God kept them from recognizing him. So Jesus comes along and strolling alongside them. They don't recognize at this point that it's Jesus. Perhaps they don't recognize him because they didn't expect it to be Jesus because they have no grid of the resurrection at this stage. Perhaps they're distracted. When people go through extreme tragedy, everything around them seems to get a little dizzy and they just don't see clearly. But in addition to this, somehow Luke tells us God kept them from recognizing Jesus. Well, this actually makes me wonder whether we miss the presence of God in tragedies we go through in life, but that's another message for another day. But Jesus asked them, what are you discussing so intently as you walk along? They stopped short, sadness written all across their faces. Then one of them, Cleopas, replied, well, you must be the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about all the things that have happened these last few days. I mean, what you haven't heard about Jesus and all these things that he did, and then he's been killed, and now his tomb's empty. Everybody in Jerusalem knows this. How could you not hear if you've just come from Jerusalem? And the irony, of course, is that it's Jesus who's walking alongside them, and Jesus who has the full story, and they don't actually have the whole story, but Jesus says to them, tell me more. So Cleopas just kind of lets it all out, this disappointment he's feeling. The things that happened to Jesus, he says, this man from Nazareth, he was a prophet who did these powerful miracles, and he was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and all the people, but our leading priests and other religious leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the Messiah who would come to rescue Israel. This all happened 3 days ago. And then some women from our group of his followers were at the tomb early this morning, and they came back with this amazing report. They said his body was missing, and they had seen angels who had told them that Jesus is alive. Some of the men ran out to see, and sure enough, his body was gone, just as the woman had said. Burst it all out, his confusion, his disillusionment, his shrinking faith, his anger. He's just trying to make sense of this whole story. And Luke tells us Jesus walks along with them, and Jesus begins to unpack the stories of the Old Testament and how all these stories that we often see are irrelevant. Jesus kind of unpacks them and shows these two disciples how they all pointed to this one called Jesus, and how all these promises were true and centered in Jesus, and Jesus would come and reverse all the chaos of our world, and he would bring hope to everybody. He would reverse the brokenness in homes and neighborhoods and the environment. He would make all things new again. This is what happened as Jesus opened the scriptures and their pulses began to race with excitement and anticipation. And Luke continues. By this time, they were nearing Emmaus and the end of their journey. Jesus acted as if he was going on, but they begged him, stay the night with us since it's getting late. So he went home with them. And as they sat down to eat, he took the bread and blessed it. Then he broke it and gave it to them. Suddenly their eyes were opened and they recognized him. At that moment, he disappeared. Normally the host at a household would be the one to break the bread, but Jesus on this occasion kind of steps in and begins to lead, and he's the one who breaks the bread. You can imagine this couple sitting around with Jesus, and they're just enjoying all the conversation that's been happening, and then suddenly it just dawns on them, this is Jesus, the resurrected Jesus is here among us. And they suddenly realize. There's a famous painting by Caravaggio, who captures this scene in a painting called The Supper of Emmaus. He actually did a couple by the same name. This is his later one, often used in universities as a study of light and shadows. A lot more subtler in the story than the earlier one, but I think a lot more intense at the same time. So here's a man in the painting at the table with these two friends. There's bread on the tablecloth as Jesus dines with these two disciples. His eyes are closed in prayer as he raises his hand to bless the bread he's about to break. In the scene, you might notice the lamb that's about to be served as well, the symbol of the sacrificial death, the reminder of Passover and the way Jesus fulfills all these feasts and festivals of the Hebrew Scriptures. Jesus dying as a substitute for others. Everything in the painting points to this being Jesus. But these disciples have just grasped what's happening. The disciple on the left with his back to us is leaning forward. He's hanging on Jesus' every word. The disciple on the right grips the edges of the table with both hands. He's leaning forward, gazing at Jesus, wants to grab him by the hand as well. Everything suddenly comes together for these two as they see Jesus in the breaking of bread. But at that moment, Jesus disappears. We read elsewhere that Jesus would appear to over 500 different people, all on this day. See, I love the way these two disciples respond to what just happened. It's what they said to each other to describe what they're feeling. Didn't our hearts burn within us as he talked with us on the road and explained the scriptures to us? And when the scriptures use the word heart, it's kind of referring to the whole person. And kind of Greek scholars would talk about that phrase, we're not our hearts burning within us, as this kind of uncontrollable desire for another. In other words, these Emmaus disciples encountered Jesus and have this life-changing experience with Jesus. They felt their hearts, their lives going out to him. They felt a love that they hadn't experienced before. And it says they felt it when the scriptures were opened and they see that Jesus is right in the center of the story and that this Jesus wants to have a relationship with them. See, the reason Luke writes this is because he wants this to be your experience and my experience. He wants our hearts to burn within us. He wants us to have a life-changing personal encounter with Jesus, not just once, but again and again and again. Luke understands that there's times when our faith does falter, when the story of salvation just seems too good to be true, when we still want to believe in Jesus, but sometimes we just find it so hard to know for sure. But he tells these honest stories in a way that cause us to sit back and ponder and then actually respond in some way. See, there will be people in the room today who have not personally responded to Jesus. And I think the question Luke wants you to have in your mind today is, what stops you from making this very moment the moment when you talk to Jesus and begin a relationship with him? Because right now can be that moment. See, perhaps you're aware of the broken pieces in your life and how it just doesn't feel like there's anything you can do about it. Perhaps you've had this nagging sense of disappointment and disillusionment with the treadmill you've been on for so long, and deep down you know that you're putting your hope in something that's ultimately going to disappoint you. Like Steve Jobs, you really want to believe that there is something more to this life than just living and working and dying. And you see, that's what this whole story of Easter is all about. It's about the something out there breaking into our world from outside and showing us that this world is not all that there is. It's like Easter kind of pulls back the curtains of our natural existence and shows us there's some kind of power, some kind of force beyond our world that's intervened in our lives, overturning the rules of nature, bringing a dead man back to life. And none of this Easter story fits nicely into our categories of nature and science and how normal dimensions work, but that's precisely the point. The resurrection of Jesus overturns all of our thinking about what is normal and possible and defines an entirely new landscape. And you see, Luke, the writer of this gospel, wants us to grasp that this Easter story actually happened. And what this Easter story shows us is that the something that is out there is actually a someone. That the something that exists out there is not some impersonal force or power, not some subjective consciousness or some great eternal abyss. This is a personal God, a someone, a real being who stands outside of our reality. And the really stunning aspect of this Easter story is this someone stepped into our world and he lived among us as a human being. And he died on a cross and he rose again from the dead. So it's not just something out there beyond this life, it's that this God actually draws us into a living, vibrant relationship with him. See, that's why on this day, people will gather from every continent, every culture, rich, poor, young, old, well-educated, illiterate, beaten, broken, arrogant, afraid. They all gather together to celebrate this Easter because Jesus died and Jesus rose again. They all have stories to tell of the way Jesus has made a difference in their life. We've heard some of these stories just this morning There's another 200 or 300 of these stories represented on these yellow sticky notes from our service here on Friday, where people who were addicted said, I met him and he gave me power. People who were alone said, I met him and I'm not lonely anymore. People who are hopeless said, I met him and I now have a reason to live every day. People who were bitter said, I was twisted, but now I can forgive. People who were weighed down with burden said, I met him and now I experience release and joy. I'm aware of at least 6 people just this past fortnight who have taken steps to know Jesus for the very first time. 6 people who now have new life and new hope. Many of our youth in the Easter camps right now are experiencing that. We baptized Beatrice last Sunday as she went public with her faith. I love all these reminders of what Jesus is doing, how Jesus is alive and active. And again, we've heard a lot of those stories here today. And these stories are there to remind you of what is possible so that you can personally respond as well. It's not just for others. The question Luke wants us to ask, I think, is what stops you from making this your moment to step into a relationship with Jesus? So in a moment, I'm going to lead us in prayer. It might just be the very first conversation you have with Jesus to begin that journey today. I'm also conscious that there's people right here in the room who have personally responded to Jesus at some point, but you still have these nagging doubts and disappointments. Again, Luke has you in mind when he writes this story, because he knows that there's moments where we feel disappointed with God because God hasn't acted like we would like him to. We have these doubts whether our guilt and shame is really dealt with. We become confused as to whether death is not really the end. And Luke wants us to leave today with this newfound confidence that Jesus is alive and makes a difference in our lives. It's why he tells these stories of diverse groups of people from different countries and backgrounds and stages and circumstances, all coming to Jesus. We heard a couple of these stories on Friday at our Good Friday service. People like Simon, this random guy who's on his OE into Jerusalem. And then he's conscripted to carry the crossbeam for Jesus. And because of that random encounter with Jesus, he meets him, he goes home, he shares a message with his wife and children. His wife becomes the spiritual mother of the Apostle Paul. His children become these famous leaders in the church, all because of this random encounter with Jesus. We heard the story of the criminal on the cross, and this guy who deserves to be there effectively is a terrorist of Rome. And yet he cries out to Jesus in his dying moments, and Jesus responds, today you can be with me in paradise. You see, the reason, again, Luke tells these stories and others like them, like the story of the 2 at Emmaus, is because he wants every single one here to meet Jesus. He knows that as we sing and talk with Jesus, he wants our hearts to burn within us, that we would give ourselves to Jesus. We would leave today with a confident hope in Jesus and the reality of the resurrection. I think there's one other response that Luke wants us to have as his followers as well, because he finishes the story this way. Within the hour, these 2 disciples were on their way back to Jerusalem. They headed back to Jerusalem in the dark because they had this message now and they wanted to ensure everybody around them knew. And then at this moment, their sadness has been replaced with this overwhelming joy. Their disappointment is gone and they are full of excitement and they rush out and tell everyone they possibly can about the resurrected Jesus. They're completely certain of it. Their hearts have been strangely warmed. The fire that is burning within them is now kind of, sending sparks, I guess, everywhere as they head down the Emmaus road. And Luke finishes this way. There they found the 11 disciples and the others who had gathered with them, who said, the Lord has really risen. He appeared to Peter, like Jesus has been going and seen all these other people at the same time. And the 2 from Emmaus told the story of how Jesus had appeared to them as they walked along the road and how they had recognized him as he was breaking the bread. You see, the idea is you can't keep this message to yourself. Everybody around you needs to know, because we all realize that things aren't right in our neighborhoods and in our homes. We just need to look around. Our people are lonely, even though they're surrounded by masses of people. There's hostility toward ethnic groups. New Zealand has one of the highest rates of domestic violence. We've heard these things. I'm not the only one who sees that things aren't right in our lives. The way anxiety levels seem to increase in the youngest of children. We have more than we've probably ever had in generations before us, but we seem to face more depression and angst and breakup and disappointments. But the power of Jesus, this good news of Jesus, is able to step in and speak to our broken lives, our broken neighborhoods, our broken families. Jesus is able to turn everything around and step into the messiness and the chaos and bring beauty and order. This power of the resurrection that Cynthia spoke of before is in us as followers of Jesus and is able to transform everything because Christ has truly risen and he's able to change lives today. I'd like to lead us in a prayer of thanks to Jesus for the difference he's able to make, and also an opportunity for every single one here to respond to Jesus and this life-giving message of the resurrection. Let's pray together. I'm going to pause at different points during the prayer just for you to be able to take these words and make them your own as you talk to Jesus today. Jesus, thank you that when I talk to you, I'm talking to a real being who lived, died, and rose again. Thank you that you show me that there is life beyond this life, a tangible physical reality. Thank you that there is more to this life than what I see and experience. That it's not just living and working and dying. I now see that you've made this desire within me, a desire for a relationship with you that can only be satisfied in you. So Jesus, I want to be in a living relationship with you. I believe that you lived and died and rose again. I believe that you're able to take all of my baggage and sin and messes and exchange it for your perfection. Jesus, thank you for the certain hope I now have because of your death and resurrection. Jesus, help me to speak this message of hope to others. And help me to partner with you as you reverse the brokenness and decay of our world. And by the power of your resurrection, that you can renew all things. Allow us in these next few minutes, Jesus, as we worship you together, to once again be overwhelmed by the glimpse of your power, the power of the resurrection that is available to all of us. Thank you, Jesus. Amen.